vulnerability. Isn't that just everybody's favorite thing? Yeah, June is the month of vulnerability, looking at the power of vulnerability and looking at how we respond to vulnerability when it's somebody else's, and when it's our own. Because I think one of the things that we tend to do unintentionally is sort of push vulnerability away, whether it's our own or encountering somebody else's. I used to be one of those people who, when somebody cried, would always want to go over and give them tissues and pat them on the back or give them a hug or something. And I think I was in ministerial school before somebody said, don't do that. Because when you do that, what you're trying to do is make them feel better so they'll stop crying so it won't make you uncomfortable. And I realized that was my motivation, was like, oh, it's okay, and trying to calm them down, rather than being witness to their experience and supporting them in it. I was trying to fix it or change it and take their experience away from them. It's a subtle thing between actually being a witness and a presence of comfort and being somebody who's trying to interfere with somebody else's experience. It doesn't always feel like being interfered with, and it does tend to make us stop crying and calm down. But I don't know that that's always the best thing in the first moment. Does this make sense, what I'm saying to you? Okay. So we're talking about the power of vulnerability. And vulnerability, there is something about it that can be so compelling. How many of you have ever had a dog? Okay. That's an open heart. Really, your dog, you can do no wrong. Your dog doesn't care if you smell bad, if you've been out overnight, if your dog doesn't care. Your dog is just happy to see you. And from a dog's point of view, probably the smellier you are, the more they like you. But, they absolutely have an open heart. They forgive everything. And it's like looking at little baby anythings. Little baby anythings are very responsive to life around them. They're not intimidated by much. They're curious, and they're available, and they're engaged. So there's something compelling about that vulnerability. That is a vulnerability that isn't coming from need and pain as much as it's coming from availability and curiosity and openness. So when we feel vulnerable, a lot of times we identify that with feeling endangered or less than or needy. And when we have felt that way and have needed something from someone and gotten shut down, it can feel embarrassing and scary. It can make you kind of mad or not trust that person as much when you've shared vulnerability with them and they've kind of shut you down. Now, I think that when we get shut down that way, it's really more about the person's discomfort than it is about us, although I must admit that we can all be unskilled about things on both sides of that. But I want to talk about an experience of vulnerability that was embarrassment, and I think you can probably all relate to this. I heard this story years ago about a gal who was on a new exercise program, and she was really doing her best, and she had gone for a run and done her stretches, and she was feeling very proud of herself. Can anybody relate to that? I did it. And so she decided she was due for a reward, so she went for ice cream. Now, this was back in Connecticut, and you may or may not know that Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward lived in a small town in Connecticut that has a wonderful little ice cream shop. And this is where this woman, evidently this is a true story, I don't know for sure, she walked into the ice cream shop to order her ice cream. And the minute she walked in the door, she saw Paul Newman over in the corner. Now, some of you may be too young to know who he was, but when he was young, oh my. You couldn't draw breath, he was so beautiful. Blue eyes, just amazing. He's over in the corner, he looks up and smiles. And she just goes into paralysis at that moment. And she's thinking, oh my God, it's Paul Newman. It's Paul Newman in the corner. She can't catch her breath. And finally she says to herself, you're 35 years old, you have 3 kids, get a grip. Just say hello. Just, smile, nod, order your ice cream. And so she does. And she goes over and she orders her ice cream, and the guy, takes her order and everything, and she's still very discombobulated. She pays for her ice cream. She walks out to go to her car, And she realizes she doesn't have the ice cream. And she thinks, oh, I'm going to have to walk back in there in front of Paul Newman to pick that ice cream up. Either I left the poor guy there holding it for me when I paid for it, or it's still sitting in the holder. So she thinks, okay, I can do this. I'll go in, I'll just smile and nod in his direction. I'll go get my ice cream and I'll leave and I'll, maintain my dignity. So she takes a breath, she walks back in through the front door and she looks over at Paul Newman and smiles and he says, you put it in your purse. Now, how exactly do you recover from that moment, There's no good way to go forward from there. You can turn and flee, you can look in your purse. There's just no good way to go there. That's a moment of vulnerability and certainly open-heartedness, but it definitely left her in an awkward position or situation. I want to talk about the closed heart and the open heart. So our question this morning is, what an open heart can do, or what can an open heart do? An open heart that's available. So we can have a closed heart, we can have a locked heart, we can have an open heart. Now, if you've got a closed heart, what happens is that life begins to shrink because there are so many things that could endanger that heart that we have to filter out of our experience. So we stay away from these places, we stay away from those people, we stay away from these conversations, we stay away from those situations. So our life shrinks. We become cautious and withholding, maybe a little suspicious and avoidant. So life gets smaller when the heart is closed. However, a closed heart is a heart that has been wounded, and it could be reopened. A locked heart is a little different. A locked heart is some situation where the wounds have been deeper or more often or more prevalent. It takes a lot more to unlock and open a locked heart, and it requires more of us inside. It also requires something often from the outside to assist us to actually feel safe enough to unlock and open up. On the other hand, an open heart has an availability that allows life to expand. So like a little child who's learning, who's curious about the world, the more we're available, the more becomes available to us. And so life actually gets bigger with that curiosity. We become more giving, more participating, more interactive. We want to engage rather than avoiding it. So we're receiving our lifeblood that way when we're available with an open heart. And I think that really the open heart is a reflection of the infinite in us. So this infinite is flowing out in every direction from our hearts. Here we are. I don't know if you can see the chakras there. We are aligned in our energy. We are present in time and space on this earth plane here and now. And at the same time, we are a passage for that infinite love to come and go through us. So I think that really we could say that this kind of open-heartedness is our own natural state. It's our own original way of being. And we might ask, well, why? Why is that our natural state? It's because of the power of an open heart. It is healing, it is transformative, it is surprising, and it reveals things that you weren't expecting, that you couldn't have predicted or known. Ernest Holmes, our founder, wrote in Help for Today, there is in every being's heart the love of wonder, the undaunted challenge of events, the unfailing childlike appetite for what next, and the joy and the game of life. You are as young as your faith, as old as your fear, as young as your hope, as old as your despair. In the central place of every heart, Holmes says, there is a recording chamber. So long as it receives messages of beauty, cheer, and courage, so long are you young. A recording a recording chamber in your heart. And I'm going to say more about the heart as a recording chamber a little later on. I love this quote from Joseph Campbell, too. And this was from his interview with Bill Moyer many years ago. Yeah. And he's talking about following your bliss, whatever that is. And he says, I have the firm belief in this now. Not only in terms of my own experience, but in knowing about the experiences of others, that when you follow your bliss, and by bliss, I mean a deep sense of being in it, and doing what the push is out of your own existence, you follow that, and doors will open where you would not have thought there were going to be doors, and where there wouldn't be a door for anyone else. There is something about the integrity of a life, and the world moves in and helps. That's a powerful statement to me, that when you follow what the push is out of your own life, the universe conspires to support that and to help you. And then Krishnamurti said, the moment you have in your heart this extraordinary thing called love and feel the depth, the delight, the ecstasy of it, you will discover that for you, the world is transformed. Sometimes in that moment, the world doesn't transform for anybody else, but it does transform for us. It begins to reveal. It begins to reveal hidden truths. It begins to reveal our natural, innate interconnectedness, our oneness, and that hidden world that Krishnamurti is talking about. It begins to reveal the depth of kindness that is present in other people, the depth of humor or thoughtfulness or delight or creativity. When we are closed-hearted, we can't really access those things as easily because we're anesthetized. So even if we witness them, we can't feel them in the same way. I can remember saying at one point in my life when I was depressed that I felt like I couldn't feel my life. I was alive, but I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel my life. So when this open-heartedness comes to us, it requires certain things. It requires a change in our viewpoint, a change in our perspective, in our point of view. You all know I like to talk about caterpillars and butterflies. There is a difference in how the caterpillar perceives the butterfly. How the caterpillar perceives the world and how the butterfly perceives the world. It's a completely different point of view. A caterpillar creeps on the ground and can climb on things, as it can only go as far up on any bush or shrub or tree as it can climb. And its view is limited to what it can see from there. A butterfly soars above that, and it has a completely different perspective on what is happening on the ground because it has that bigger view. So if we want to live from an open heart, if we want to be able to have that larger life, the cocoon has got to go. The chrysalis has got to go. And we've got to stop crawling on the ground when we have now the capacity to fly. How many butterflies do we see crawling on the ground? I can't even think of one I've ever seen crawling on the ground. They might sit still on a flower or a bush or on your finger, but their life is light. It's above. It's in the air. It sees so much more. And that's what we're invited into with an open heart. Rather than plodding on the ground, opening and actually taking wing, taking flight. But it requires a change in our point of view. We can't hold on to the same old opinions, the same old viewpoint, the same old judgments, and soar. They're too heavy. They weight us down onto the ground, creeping along in the muck, or even, in the nice grass. But it's not the same thing as the freedom of that larger point of view. So I said that the heart is a recording chamber. Many years now ago, Paul Pearsall, who is a PhD, had a heart transplant, and he began to have a strange experience. And he discovered that other people who had had transplants had, not everybody, had similar kinds of experiences, but especially people who had had heart transplants, that the recipient of the new heart sometimes could access passions and fears and delights and interests and even experience and memories of the person whose organ they had received. Those things had been recorded in that heart. Now there's a theory, a living systems theory says that in living systems, everything, molecules, cells, atoms, have a systemic memory. They actually have a systemic memory. So I read, about 10 different cases of people who had received heart transplants who did not know what their recipient or what their donor's history was. But the researcher knew the donor's history and the recipient's history. And this is a particular case. The donor was a 16-month-old boy named Jerry who had drowned. And the recipient, Carter, was a 7-month-old boy who was diagnosed with 4 congenital heart defects. Now, these reports came in when Carter was about 5 years old. So the donor's mother, this is Jerry's mother, who was a physician, said, the first thing is that I could more than hear my son's heart. When Carter first saw me, he ran to me and pushed his nose against me and rubbed it. It was just exactly what we did with Jerry. Jerry and Carter's heart is now 5 years old. But Carter's eyes, or Jerry's eyes, when he hugged me, I could feel my son. I mean, I could feel him, not just symbolically. He was there. I felt his energy. I'm a doctor. I'm trained to be a keen observer, and I've always been a natural-born skeptic. But this was real. My husband and my father felt it too. We stayed with the recipient's family that night, and in the middle of the night, Carter came in and asked to sleep with my husband and me. He cuddled up between us, exactly like Jerry did, and we both began to cry. Carter told us not to cry because Jerry said everything was okay. My husband and I, and our parents, and those who really knew Jerry, have no doubt our son's heart contains much of our son and beats in Carter's chest. On some level, our son is still alive. And the recipient's mother said this. She said, I saw Carter go to her, Jerry's mother. He never does that. He is very, very shy. But he went to her just like he used to run to me when he was a baby. And when he whispered, it's okay, Mama, I broke down. He called her mother, or maybe it was Jerry's heart talking. And then she goes on to say, when we went to church together, Carter had never met Jerry's father. We came in late, and Jerry's dad was sitting with a group of people in the middle of the congregation. And Carter let go of my hand and ran right to that man. He climbed on his lap, hugged him, and said, Daddy. We were flabbergasted. How could he have known him? Why did he call him Dad? He never did things like that. He would never let go of my hand in church and never run to a stranger. When I asked him why he did it, he said he didn't. He said Jerry did it, and he went with him. Those reports came in 2005. I don't know what happened with the young boy later on. Now, there are many adults who are heart transplant recipients who have similar kinds of experiences. Some of them suddenly become vegetarian when they'd always been meat eaters. Some of them are afraid of things that they have no explanation for, which in the donor's family is how the donor died sometimes. So these stories, it's like the interconnectedness that we begin to feel, the oneness that we begin to recognize, that literally, in this case, comes from an open heart, a heart that was transplanted, and its feelings, its love, its experiences somehow remain and become a connection between the donor and the recipient. The HeartMath Institute did an experiment quite a long time ago now about DNA. So they took DNA from placentas, which is apparently like virgin DNA. It's the purest DNA there is. And they put it in 28 different little containers, and they gave it to 28 trained researchers who had really been trained to go deeply into the feeling level. So they felt strong feelings and clear feelings, and each one had been trained to do that. So what was discovered in the process with these little vials was that the DNA in the vials changed its shape based on the feelings of the researchers. Now, it wasn't even their own DNA. When the researchers felt gratitude and love and appreciation, the DNA relaxed and the strands became less tightly wound. The length of it actually became longer. And when they felt anger or fear or frustration or stress, the DNA tightened up and became shorter, and it even switched off some of its codes. When this experiment was tested later with HIV patients, they discovered that feelings of love and gratitude and appreciation created 300,000 times the immune system resistance that they normally had without those feelings. These emotional changes go beyond the effects of electromagnetics. Individuals trained in deep love were able to change the shape of that DNA. And Greg Braden says that this illustrates a newly recognized form of energy that connects all of creation. Essentially, we're able to influence this web of creation through our vibration. I had somebody once say to me, when I'm in a bad mood, people stay away from me in droves. I think it's the vibration. When you go into a place that doesn't feel right and you can't really explain why, sometimes it's just best to leave that place. When we're with a group of people in a room and it doesn't feel right for some reason, I'm not talking about feeling lonely or disengaged, but doesn't feel right, then what we want to do is move on. And when we enter a room where we feel a presence of love, a presence of welcome, a presence of the oneness, the connectedness, we want to be there. We want to connect and involve ourselves there because something feels nourishing. It feels real and whole to us. And so that becomes a place for us to go. This vibrational communication center, this heart, becomes that energetic bridge between the donor and the recipient, but also I think it becomes an energetic bridge simply between us and among us as individuals. Our summer conference at Asilomar lasted for many, many, many years. Centers for Spiritual Living had an annual summer conference at Asilomar on the Monterey Bay Peninsula in August. It started off with Ernest Holmes himself going and being there. One year, an astronaut whose last name is O'Leary, and now I can't remember his first name for some reason. He was in the astronaut program. He never actually went to a planet, but he did go into space. And he was talking about the power of our energy. And he was using a dowsing thing. What do you call this thing? Rod, a dowsing rod, that would open or close. And he had us do an experiment. So Merrill Hall, full of people up in the balcony, down in the seats. Brian O'Leary. He had a woman come up on the stage with him, just somebody randomly. And he said, all right, I'm going to walk toward her, and the way the dowsing rods respond has to do with her energy, the level of her energy. And so he did that, and he got fairly close, and they opened up somewhat. And then he said, all right, now I want you to think negatively about her. Think critically about her somehow. Just think those thoughts. And he stepped back, and when he walked toward her, the dowsing rods didn't open at all. He got all the way up to her, and there was nothing. It was like the energy she had drained away from her. And then he said, okay, we don't want to leave her like that, so we're going to switch that. Now I want you to think of her lovingly, to send her love. This whole room full of people. And as he started to walk toward her, he barely moved, and the thing flew open, you know, just to recognize the way in which she responded to knowing it was being given to her and receiving it and letting it in. All of these things, to me, are examples of our interconnectedness and what happens and what we can do collectively as well as individually when we recognize that. We have an enormous amount of power, really, collectively, to change the world. And yet most of the time we feel so disempowered individually, looking at how big and vast and complex things can be and how challenging it can be. And yet a unified group of people who connect with another unified group of people and another unified group of people can bring forth a wave of change that uplifts all of us. When we get the bigger view, when we have that big picture vision, that vision of the butterfly, then it becomes actually contagious. So here we have a heart that is recording memories. It has storing vibrations of love. And it's just like, you know, I have a Macintosh computer, and my time machine thing is like this. When I want to go back and see if there's something I can find that I deleted unintentionally, I could go back and look at all these different dates in Time Machine, and it looks just like that. It's a row of stuff going back, and you can choose which date you want to look at. That's just my geekiness coming into the service. But when we have this storage to draw on, we can find this larger perspective. So, I'm sorry these slides are so dark. We're still using the old projector here, which is even off center a little bit today. But this is a person who's got a heart in his or her chest that matches the heart in the universe. And the thing is that when we have this vibrating within us, it becomes contagious. The so what becomes so what next? What now? Because in that vibration, we make these connections with one another. And you know what? I'm not even sure that the transformation of the world requires us all to believe the same things or come from the same place or even actively take an action to try and change the world, as much as it is that when we live from that place in us, we will find the things that are right for us to do. And as we show up in those places and do that, it becomes contagious. We may not be talking about changing the world, but our beingness helps encourage one more to be courageous, helps encourage one more to shine their light, inspires somebody else to find their way. Reverend Sarah invited me to the Pachamama Alliance's annual fundraiser luncheon about 6 months ago. And I was caught up in that moment with the commitment and the vision and the results that this organization was experiencing. I didn't join Pachamama Alliance, but it lifted me into more of what I do myself and what I am engaged in. It became an inspiring contagion for me, not to do their work specifically, but to support it and to do my work specifically. So what happens is it becomes contagious, it motivates our choices, and ultimately I think it does change the world. Maybe in subtle ways it changes the world until the accumulation begins to become really apparent. It realigns us with that vision of truth that is beyond the appearances that we're looking at, whatever we think that those appearances are that seem so overwhelming that we don't know what to do. There is something more. In Living the Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes said, the mental embodiment of an idea, or the true mental equivalent, which is jargon for, the mental embodiment of an idea, or the true mental equivalent of something is not so much the word we speak, as it is something we feel in the heart. The words we speak should emerge from that place, not just from here. Although Holmes did say, even if you can't get to your heart, don't stop praying. It's always better if you can pull it all together, but if you have to just speak from your head, do that. But when you can engage the feeling, that's where the real deep juice and power lie. And the book of Proverbs says this, and it's so interesting talking about the heart as a recording chamber. The book of Proverbs says this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Everything you do flows from it. And that's because of the recording chamber. It keeps for us then our grudges, our joys, our sorrows, our likes, our dislikes, our growth, our memories, our hopes and dreams. It records all of it. You know, I believe it was in Egypt with the pharaohs. When they buried them, they took the brain out and kind of threw it away, I think, because they didn't know what that was for. But the heart was very important. It was honored. And if you ever saw Little Big Man, the movie Little Big Man from a gazillion years ago, there's a scene where grandfather, played by Chief Dan George, the old Indian, has gone blind. And Dustin Hoffman, who has spent time with him and calls him grandfather, comes back and sees him and he says, I see, are you blind, grandfather? He says, oh no, my eyes see as well as they ever did, but the light from my heart no longer reaches them, so I don't see. The light from my heart no longer reaches them. That's a very different perspective on us seeing our eyes as the place that receives what comes in. He was receiving what was around him through the light in his heart. That's a very different perspective. And who's to say that there isn't great truth in that what we see arises out of what is in our heart? So finally, the interconnected oneness that we are sometimes brings forth an unexpected grace. This is called The Day I Forgave My Father, written by Tony Alicia. I was heading home from hanging out with some friends after church. It was a great morning, followed by some much-needed time to connect with some of my new guy friends. I was relatively new to the church and just starting to feel planted. And as I was driving home, the phone buzzed in my pocket, and I stared at it for a few rings. It was my dad. I didn't really want to talk to him right then. I didn't feel like going through the motions of small talk, telling him that I was fine, I was glad he was fine, everything was fine. I was about to let it go to voicemail when I felt something compel me to answer. Hello? I answered. Hey, son, how are you? He said in a cheerful voice. I'm fine, I muttered. Here we go again. Why did I even pick up? I really wasn't in the mood for pleasantries with my dad. I didn't understand why, being absent for the majority of my life, he now wanted to be a part of my life. I was 28 years old and no longer a little boy whose heart leapt at the voice of his father. I'd forgiven him a long time ago. I'd made peace with it. I just didn't feel like it was necessary to be friends with a man that I didn't know. The next words out of his mouth snapped me out of my inaudible sigh and the roll of the eyes. Son, I accepted Jesus as my Savior today. The rest of the conversation was a blur. I vaguely remember him sharing the story of how it all happened, but that was just background noise as those first words he spoke resonated in my head. I probably should have shouted for joy, but all I could say was, wow, that's great. He ended the phone call saying that he wanted to see me as soon as possible. He was anxious to confirm a date because he felt like God wanted him to share some things with me in person. Yeah, let's do that. I hung up the phone and drove home in silence. I was stunned. About a month later, my dad was in my house, sitting on the couch. We just came back from eating dinner and sharing our first beer as father and son. I peppered him with questions all night about what his life was like. He told me stories I'd never heard before. He told me what it was like to be in the Army. I heard stories about his parents. It was an emotional night, and he hadn't even brought up the main reason he came to see me. Back in my apartment, he stammered a bit before getting started. He began by saying that since he met God, he felt that he was being led to make things right in his life. And then he came out with it. He wanted to give me an opportunity to tell him what I felt by his absence in my life. He wanted me to be honest and share everything that I was carrying. He said he wasn't there to apologize or make it right. He just wanted me to tell him how I felt. My first response was to tell him that I already had forgiven him a long time ago. I told him that it was difficult growing up without him. But when I got older, I made peace with it. I wasn't angry with him. But then something happened. As I began to talk about it, all these memories flooded my mind. Tears welled up in my eyes, and something inside me felt like it burst open. I told him how much it hurt when he disappeared from my life. I told him that I always wondered if he didn't want me as his son because he never sent for me in the summers. I told him that I longed for his approval when I got A's on my report cards. I desperately wanted him to be there to coach my basketball team. I told him that I needed him, and he abandoned me. I don't remember how long I went on, but it all flooded out, and he just sat there and listened. Tears filled his eyes, but he never once defended himself, never once made an excuse. He just took it all in, and then he cried with me. I thought I had forgiven my father, but I realized I had just excused him. When I finished unloading, he said that he would not even try to apologize for what happened. He said that simply saying sorry would not make it right. He just accepted and admitted that he'd been wrong. And it was then that I realized that after all these years, I didn't want an apology. I just wanted him to listen to me and admit that he was wrong. That was when I forgave my father. And that was when I finally made peace with him. That day, I began to let go of all the anger and bitterness and resentment I had held on to so tightly. Even the feelings I had pushed down and pretended I had dealt with. That day, I learned that forgiving him wasn't just for his sake, but for mine too. And so I want us to think about today how open our hearts are, not only to our moments, our own moments of vulnerability, but to those who have deeply hurt us and to those experiences. You know, Ernest Holmes said, never carry the corpse of a mistaken yesterday. And his image was that we go dragging these corpses around with us, big heavy corpses of the past, of things that hurt us, or things that we did wrong that we feel bad about. We drag them around with us, and they become heavier and heavier, and we become more and more oblivious to our lives. And what he said was, put the corpse down, let it go. Let it go, find a way. So if we feel that our hearts are closed, even partially closed in some way, then I want to encourage and suggest to all of us that we consider where we can allow our vulnerability to bring forth some healing. Now, it may be people have died. It may be people that we feel it would create a lot more difficulty if we were to contact them than not. I'm not saying that you need to talk to anybody about this. It's an inside job. But that is definitely the place to start. Namaste.